China has had an absolutely crazy last week with a whole load of different things going on. There have been protests, there have been borderline riots, tanks have been sent in to deal with these protesters, and of course, it all stems from the collapsing property market that really kicked off about 3 years ago now as the Chinese Communist Party put into place short-sighted legislation that doomed the entire property market to collapse. Of course, today we're going to cover exactly what's going on, what the developments over the last week are, and just why the Chinese state is in a whole load of trouble, despite what you might hear from the shills here on YouTube. Now, to start off, for the last month or so, we've been hearing snippets of news coming out from Henan province in China regarding a load of different small regional banks that have basically been running out of money. They've been going bankrupt because of their poor business decisions. Now, there are millions of individual Chinese citizens who use these banks exactly how you would expect, as banks. They just store their money with them, they use them to make payments to take in their salaries, and then one day, out of nowhere, the ATMs stopped working, the bank tellers stopped forking out cash, and these people found themselves incapable, unable to withdraw any of their money from these banks. Now, this, of course, stems from the property market collapse that China has been experiencing for over a year now, because these banks were the financing behind the property developers which have been building thousands upon thousands of apartment blocks for decades on end. Now, these developers weren't exactly being responsible either. They were taking out huge amounts of leverage and paying extortionate interest rates because during a property boom, when this bubble was growing, they could afford to pay off this debt. But when things started to slow, suddenly every single property developer in China found themselves underwater with debt, unable to pay back their liabilities. Of course, these liabilities came from these banks themselves, and so they saw the loans that they'd given out to property developers basically not being repaid, and there's no sign of them being repaid into the future either, so these banks are now finding themselves impacted by the collapse as well. Now, these banks literally just turned off the taps and they've refused to pay anything out. They've declared all deposits in their organizations as investment vehicles, which under Chinese law means that these citizens have no legal right to get their money back, which is absolutely insane. But unfortunately for the honest, hardworking, average Chinese citizen, the Communist Party doesn't care, and they've actually sent the police in to protect these banks at the expense of their citizens. Now, as I said, there are millions of individual people who have been affected by this, and there is billions of dollars that has just been stolen from these innocent people, but the Communist Party is on the bank's side, and so over recent weeks, tensions have started to grow and protests have started to build outside these banks, which started off getting violent because the Chinese Communist Party sent secret police in to attack these protesters and to break things up. Unfortunately, though, this wasn't enough and the CCP chose to escalate it further, which is where we got the news earlier on in the week that the Chinese army had been sent in with main battle tanks to disperse these protesters. Now, this is, of course, extremely reminiscent of the Tiananmen Square massacre about 40 years ago today, where thousands of innocent student protesters were murdered by the communist state purely for exercising their right to free speech. This threat of violence, though, by the Chinese state, it worked. It shut these protesters up and it sent them home because, frankly, they didn't want to be murdered, and I really can't fault them there. The problem is, though, this money is still stolen. These banks are still bankrupt, these developers are still out of money too, and this situation has no endpoint because the Communist Party simply doesn't care about its citizens at this point. Of course, though, the problems that China is facing doesn't stop there. Over the last 2 years or so, we've seen massive, monumental regulatory crackdowns against various different tech companies across China that have destroyed businesses, destroyed livelihoods, bankrupted individuals, turned billionaires into poor people overnight, and even the entire education industry nationalized overnight as profit was made illegal. Now, Didi was one of the worst hit companies from these regulatory crackdowns. Now, it was basically a clone of Uber. If you wanted to choose one singular company to explain Chinese IP theft and just how outrageous it can be, then Didi would probably be the one to look at. But without a doubt, it is successful in China, or it was until about a year ago. Now, as a fast-growing tech company that wants to continue to raise capital, to continue to grow and actually expand into other Asian markets, it sought to go public to raise money. And the best public markets in the world are, of course, American ones because that's where the money is. Unfortunately for Didi, though, listing in the US would provoke the wrath of the Communist Party. They were unhappy that their domestic markets had been shunned for an American enemy market, and so they unleashed hell upon Didi. Within days of them listing, China basically made it illegal for them to grow any further by banning new customers from signing up with Didi and eventually going on to ban them from operating at all. They claim that this was because the company was leaking private information about its users to the US, but it has failed and it has still to this day never put forward any serious information or evidence to actually prove these claims. Frankly, they're lies and everyone on Earth knows it. That doesn't really matter though, because the CCP has this authority, and so the company's share price absolutely collapsed as soon as it IPO'd, and it still hasn't recovered to this day, over a year later. Now, the development here is that China has just finally decided to fine Didi $1.2 billion on top of their other restrictions, which is an absolutely massive fine. Now, surprisingly enough though, investors seem to be happy about this news because they think it's the end of this saga. They think that now Didi has been fined, it won't ever be punished by the Communist Party again, and so the share price has risen by about 30% since this fine was announced. The problem is though, this won't be the end of the regulatory crackdowns, and it certainly won't be the end of Didi being targeted by the CCP either, because this is how authoritarian regimes work. First we saw Ant Group attacked, and then Didi, and then the entire education industry. And since then, every week or so, we get more news of another company coming under attack by the Communist Party as they insist on extending their authority, and that will never stop so long as the Communist Party exists. This is, though, part of what's creating the next problem that China is facing that has really come to a head over the last week, and that is, surprisingly or not surprisingly in my opinion, capital flight. Rich Chinese people worth $48 billion want to run away from the company because they are scared and they want to take their wealth with them. Now here, I really can't blame these people. It's an awful deal to live in China at all, with their government being so authoritarian and being so ruthless when it comes to cracking down on dissent. This is, though, bad news for the Chinese country and the government in the long term, because these are the smartest and the richest people in the country, the entrepreneurs, the innovators, the growers. In the long run, this will be massively detrimental to China because it will act like a brain drain. It will act as capital flight, sucking capitalism out from the markets and stagnating the country. Of course, though, this isn't a done deal yet. The CCP is notoriously authoritarian, and they already make it very difficult to get money out of the country, specifically for this reason, to stop the best and the brightest from running away. We should expect over coming weeks and months to read more about how the CCP plans to maintain this policy, how they plan to ensure that people don't emigrate out of the country and they don't take their money with them. Now, while some people leave though, certain businesses are actually going further into the belly of the beast, cooperating with the Communist Party and using their protection to grow and expand their market. Of course, here we're talking about HSBC, which is probably the most morally bankrupt bank in the world. It has been convicted of smuggling drug money for Colombian drug cartels, and it is of course not above working with a genocidal Chinese regime either. The news here is that HSBC have just installed a CCP committee into one of their investment subsidiaries, so the CCP now has senior management party officials changing and affecting the way that this bank is run. Now, this has actually been a long time coming. The Communist Party has been demanding this of certain Western banks for a long time now. They've already enforced these sort of rules on a bunch of different tech companies in those tech crackdowns that we spoke about earlier. But HSBC has gone a different direction and decided to do this willingly before it's mandated by law, choosing to cement its place as a Chinese bank first and foremost, putting profit before morality. Now, of course, the Communist Party's influence will grow within HSBC. You don't seriously think that they're going to settle for just one committee within one subsidiary of this bank, do you? No, they're going to continue to grow, continue to spread their tentacles, and eventually take over this entire bank, along with the entire financial industry in China. This here is just a sign of the growing authority of the Communist Party, of their growing control, and it lines up perfectly with the Communist Party's actions regarding COVID and lockdowns in particular. Now, speaking of COVID and lockdowns, Macau has been the worst hit city from COVID lockdowns in the entire world, and we've just seen the data come out to prove this. Now, Macau, if you didn't know, is a gambling hub, and actually 3 years ago, it was the largest singular gambling city in the world, with gambling revenues 6 times larger than Las Vegas. Today, though, its revenues only make up 80% of what Las Vegas brings in, and this is a massive problem for the city because almost all of its government revenue comes from this gambling in the first place. Now, the reason for this fall in revenues on the surface is very simple. Apparently, COVID outbreaks keep occurring and the city has to be shut down. These gambling casinos have to be shut down in order to stop the spread. Of course, though, that isn't the whole story. Really, the CCP is using this excuse of COVID and lockdowns as a disguise to increase their authority and to increase their control over what used to be a semi-quasi-independent state. The sinister side of this is that Macau is going to go bankrupt. The city will run out of money, and the only authority that will be able to rescue it will be the Communist Party, and with that rescue package will without a doubt come more authoritarianism and more control over the city and its citizens by the Chinese mainland. Just like we saw with Hong Kong over recent years, the CCP is absolutely intent on ensuring that every single part of the country is entirely under its control and that democracy does not exist at all. Now, the short-term impacts of this are rather basic and rather straightforward. Money will be lost, profit will disappear, and profit that isn't easy to recoup in the future either. In the long term, though, this will have massive, far-reaching consequences on Macau and China as well. This represents the slow erosion away of capitalism in China, which is the only reason the country has boomed so much over recent decades. There will be no more innovation, there will be no more entrepreneurs, and eventually there will be no more growth as capital markets are replaced by state authority. Of course, this will all come back to bite China in the arse because at the end of the day, governments cannot efficiently create wealth. Only entrepreneurs and civil individuals can go on to create wealth, so the freer a society is, the richer it becomes, and this is written in history time after time again. Of course, these aren't all the problems that China is facing. It has a rail industry that is bankrupting itself every single day. It has short-sighted and aggressive foreign policy decisions which are making it unpopular on the world stage, and it's going to run headfirst into a decoupling of supply chains as the second Cold War emerges and the West decides to base its manufacturing centers away from a country that begs for their downfall. If you enjoyed this video, then make sure to like, comment and subscribe to bless the YouTube algorithm. It really does help. If you want to join our exclusive community, then check out our Patreon. You get access to our Discord server and extra content like access to my portfolio and buy and sell alerts for all my own investments. Also, make sure to check out the link in the description to Masterworks. It can help you protect your portfolio against market turmoil through fractional shares of art from world-famous artists. Art has historically proven to be uncorrelated to the markets, so it's a really valuable resource with the markets falling every week. There's also a link in the description to I Trust Capital, which helps you to invest in crypto through your tax-advantaged IRA, which could literally save you thousands. If you, like me, think crypto going down is a buy-in opportunity, then now is the perfect time to join I Trust Capital. Thank you all for watching. Stay stoic. Until next time.